Thank you very much, Peter. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I have the pleasure of reporting back to you on a surprisingly lively breakfast session that took place this morning amongst the UN family, together with some representatives from the private sector, doing exactly what this session, I think, is aiming to achieve, which is facing reality. And I believe that perhaps what all of you feel after a first day of, in a sense, celebrating both the success of the Global Compact, the fact that so many of us are here in this hall in the year 2007 talking about the United Nations and the business world interacting. It is also a point in time for reflection, and I think this morning we had a very clear set of issues emerge that have to do with facing reality. One very interesting observation was that this is not exactly a new aspiration. In fact, our colleague Juan Somavia pointed out that enshrined in his governance of the International Labour Organization is the interaction with the private sector for decades, and it is one example of how the UN has indeed worked in the development of norms, standards and agreements on employment, labour over decades with the private sector. But we also reviewed many of the more recent interactions, which range from the kind of sponsorship, practical collaboration on sectoral issues, to much more broad initiatives, for example, on AIDS or increasingly on energy efficiency. And I think the important message that emerged from this discussion this morning is that we have to be careful that in developing the interaction between the private sector and the United Nations, we are not trying to emulate what, for example, the Clinton Foundation is trying to do. There should be, in the eyes of the world and in the eyes of the partners between the United Nations and the private sector, a clear understanding that this is not another Clinton summit kind of initiative. That when we are talking about mobilizing the United Nations, first of all, we are talking about mobilizing the will of 192 nations. It is where it derives its authority, legitimacy, and in some ways also its independence from. But also that it is an expression of public opinion, and that perhaps one of the reasons why the private sector is still, or in some people's eyes, more interested today than perhaps ever before in working with the United Nations in a globalized economy is that the United Nations at its best does stand for the development, the propagation, the dissemination, and ultimately also the monitoring and perhaps enforcement of the norms and standards that have been developed and codified into rules and agreements internationally. And in this context, it was quite interesting to talk about what does it mean to adhere to the principles of the Global Compact. Is this just aspirational? Well, the intent, as I understand, and certainly as most of us this morning interpret, is that the principles of the Global Compact are not simply aspirational statements. They are built on the foundations of rulemaking that underpin decades of developing agreements on what is right and what is wrong in our world, and how each entity, be it a private sector, a public, or indeed an individual, should be held accountable. So it is quite important, and this was another theme, to distinguish platforms for interaction, because it is not, in the first instance, a fundraising tool that we should associate with the UN and business interacting. I think we were all very clear this morning that our ultimate objective is a transformational objective. But, and this was a term used by a number of people, but Antonio Guterres put it on the table, guided by enlightened self-interest. Let us not mix up the objectives of a United Nations system with the objectives of a corporation. But let us also not fall into the trap that there are not compatible objectives that allow us to work together effectively towards achieving what ultimately are goals articulated by our societies. It is also very important to look at how, over the next few years, the United Nations system itself can become clearer about its strategy and objectives for interaction with the private sector. In diversity certainly lies great opportunity. But clearly the feedback that we receive also from many entrepreneurs, from many corporations with whom we work with, is that we are not an easy partner to engage with. That we are often a partner that on the one hand would like to go fast and straight ahead and yet in terms of its own systems, in terms of the politics, in terms of the diversity of political opinion in the United Nations, ends up going more left and more right, and sometimes being a very difficult partner to work with. One of the recommendations out of the session this morning is that we should take up the issue of private sector UN interaction at the highest level of the Chief Executive Board with our Secretary General as an explicit topic, building on the remarkable number of lessons and experiences that exist today, but also becoming clearer about the fact that when the United Nations engages with the private sector, there is a reason why the private sector is interested. It has to do with the brand, to use a private sector term of the United Nations, was certainly one of the statements this morning. And another statement was that the UN is badly underselling its brand at the moment in its partnerships with the private sector. It is making the point of entry too diffuse, the threshold too low, and ultimately the brand may be diluted by the fact that we are not clear enough in terms of which corporations are in fact performing according to the principles that the United Nations is meant to bring to the world, and which ones are not. It cannot be a supermarket of partnerships where anyone simply engages in terms of their own terms. And I think we have a duty in the United Nations, that certainly is a message from the discussions this morning, to be clearer about what it is that we are authorized and entitled to represent in terms of being an intergovernmental family of institutions, what it is that we stand for in these partnerships, and how we articulate those in terms of the self-interest of the United Nations in engaging with corporations. Because good partnerships are founded on mutually defined, clear objectives. And I think one of the lessons that many of us have drawn out of many very successful interactions over the last years in particular, where there has been a much broader spectrum of activities, of partnerships, is that we have a great deal to learn from our own experience that we have developed together. And this is also a message that I think some of you articulated yesterday and also felt perhaps after a day of looking at, in a sense, the positive side of the momentum, that if you're going to build on this and we are going to really leverage it for the future, then some clear reflection on how the United Nations as a system develops its own strategic terms of engagement is now a high priority, and why the Chief Executive Board should look towards providing both a place in which to analyze those lessons, but secondly also to articulate a strategy that allows for diversity in terms of the great diversity of institutions in the United Nations, but also responds to a public concern that the United Nations is not a brand for sale. The United Nations is a brand that people have worked over 50 years to create and that they wish to protect in terms of what it stands for. And it is precisely in the partnerships with companies who accept, respect and engage with the United Nations that we can give expression to that sentiment, which I